one of the greatest honors of my whole life was the fact I actually got to meet the great man at his home just outside Moscow back in, I think it was 1998. So I want to talk about Solzhenitsyn's role in my own journey and then my time with him in Russia, which led to my writing of my biography of Solzhenitsyn, Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile. And then we'll get on to looking at Solzhenitsyn's life. So for me, Solzhenitsyn was very important on my path to Christianity because as a teenager, I read the Gulag Archipelago, which is a 3-volume monumental work exposing the tyranny of the Soviet Union, particularly through the eyes of those who are prisoners, political prisoners in the Gulag. Should we say the concentration camp system of Soviet communism. An archipelago, as you know, it's a group of islands. So the idea of the Gulag Archipelago is there's these prisons are dotted about like islands all over the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn, in fact, was a political prisoner himself for 7 years. So he wrote about this experience and also gathered the experience of numerous other prisoners to produce this 3-volume monumental work, the Gulag Archipelago, which I read as a teenager, and it brought me into a deeper understanding, not merely of politics and political philosophy and history and the dangers of communism. It did all of those things, but it also brought me closer to Christ because in all of Solzhenitsyn's work, there's this Christian dimension either on the surface or just beneath it. So after that, I read no more Solzhenitsyn for many years, but I was very interested in politics and particularly in the sort of political philosophy of people such as Chesterton and Belloc, what became known as distributism, a manifestation of Catholic social teaching in politics and economics. And then I came across a book in the early 1990s, maybe it's around 1990 or possibly in like 1989, I'm not sure exactly, a book called Rebuilding Russia by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. I had read nothing by him for a long while, but I picked this book up, and of course this is, it must have been just after, it must have been 1990 or thereabouts, because it was after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything else, those glorious revolutions that brought down communism in Eastern Europe at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s. So rebuilding Russia was exactly about that. How do we rebuild Russia in the wake of communism? And Solzhenitsyn's political philosophy, I saw, was very similar to the political philosophy of the Catholic Church and of G.K. Chesterton and of Hilaire Belloc and of someone called E.F. Schumacher, another convert to Catholicism, who preached this small is beautiful localism that Solzhenitsyn is also teaching here. So this rekindled my love for Solzhenitsyn. So somehow or other, I published my biography of Chesterton, and then at that point, when I found out where Solzhenitsyn lived, the only book I had published at that point was my biography of Chesterton. So somehow or other, I found out where Solzhenitsyn lived, his address, and I wrote to him. And in my letter, I said that I would like I introduced myself as the biographer of Chesterton. That's the only claim to fame I had to my name at the time. So I've got to try to sell myself to Solzhenitsyn. And that I wanted to write Solzhenitsyn's biography because I did not believe that any of the existing biographies of Solzhenitsyn have paid due attention to the centrality of his Russian Orthodox faith. So that was the letter I sent, and I wasn't expecting to receive a reply. We should say, by the way, that Solzhenitsyn had basically refused to give any interviews to Western writers for several years at this point because the Western journalists had treated him so appallingly in the 1970s and 80s that he decided, well, I'm just not going to bother to talk to you anymore. So I was not expecting a reply. The best I really hoped for was to receive a thanks but no thanks letter with Solzhenitsyn's signature, which I could then frame and stick on the wall. But imagine my surprise when I actually received a letter back from the great man himself saying, yes, he would grant me an interview. I should arrange to come to Moscow to interview him and putting me in touch with 2 of his sons who speak fluent English as to serve as go-betweens to arrange for my visit. So armed with this letter, I went to London to HarperCollins, who are my publisher in London. I was obviously living in England at the time, waved this letter in front of them and said, you have to give me a contract to write this biography, and you have to give me an extra £5,000 so I can afford to go to Moscow in the first place to interview him. And my publisher was as astonished by this letter as I had been when I received it, and that was the ticket for the contract. And so then I had the job of writing the book. So I was picked up from my hotel in Moscow by Yermolai, Solzhenitsyn's eldest son. And he drove me to this big log mansion place in a pine forest, about 45 minutes or so outside Moscow, where Solzhenitsyn lived. I'm still puzzled as to why has he said yes to me when he said no to every other writer, including, of course, many writers who are better known than I am. I was perplexed. Clearly, he must agree that he wants a biography written about him that would pay due attention to his Christian faith. But still, why me? So when I arrived, before Solzhenitsyn himself appeared, his wife took me to another room, pointed to the top shelf of a bookshelf, where there was a whole row of the Ignatius Press collected works of G.K. Chesterton. So Chesterton was the magic word that got me entry into Solzhenitsyn's life and into his presence. Solzhenitsyn clearly is an admirer of the great G.K. Chesterton. And so I suppose that what Solzhenitsyn did was put two and two together. This person can write because he's already written a biography, a published biography. He is an admirer of Chesterton, which means he's probably a good fellow from the point of view of his outlook on life. And he wants to focus on my Christianity. Those three things together brought the positive reply. So just a few impressions that I got of Solzhenitsyn while I was with him in Moscow, before we go on to look at Solzhenitsyn's life itself. I was very interested in the extent to which Solzhenitsyn was aware of some of the great Western writers in the Western tradition. And he said, first of all, to me, he said, people call me a Slavophile and think that I'm opposed to the West. He said, I'm not opposed to the West. He said, Russia is part of the West. Russia is part of Western civilization. He said, if the Iron Curtain had come down and all the cream of high Western culture had seeped into Russia over the top of the Iron Curtain, he would have rejoiced. He said, but what happened instead is the Iron Curtain didn't come down, the Iron Curtain came up, and all the dregs of Western decadence seeped in to pollute Russian culture. It was this that he opposed. It's the modern Western decadence, not Western civilization, to which he was opposed. So I gave a whole list of Western writers, and he... So it was Chesterton, Belloc, T.S. Eliot, Evelyn Waugh, I can't remember all of them now, Tolkien, Lewis, and he nodded and had a glint in his eye and said, yes, he said, I know these authors, I like these authors, and I know that these authors are as unpopular with the liberals in the West as I am. And he laughed. And that's the other thing I want to say about him as well, is that most people have an image of Solzhenitsyn as being a sort of a grim, dour, somber, sober Jeremiah type figure, a prophet, a humorless prophet who lays down the law, but does not lighten up, shall we say, all gravitas and no levitas. On the contrary, what I was struck by, because that was the image I had of him, the image that most people have of him, he has these very youthful-looking eyes, china blue, with this mischievous glint in them and an infectious chuckle in his voice. And his sons have told me that he also has a very powerful ability to mimicry, and he can mimic politicians and celebrities to such a degree that he says that they tell me that he's literally had the family, rolling on the floor in hysterical laughter. So this is a man who has a great deal of joy, a great deal of humor. And this may not come across in his writing because he's very serious about what he's trying to convey in his writing, but he's a man who's certainly very, very much a joyful figure. The other thing about him was, and this connects him to The Lord of the Rings, there was a moment when I met his gaze, we met each other's gaze, and looking into each other's eyes, eye to eye. And for me, I saw, first of all, on the surface, this amazing youthfulness. So Solzhenitsyn was, I think, 79, almost 80 when I met him. And he had this very youthful surface to his eyes, agile, mischievous, alert. But as I held his gaze, I got this feeling of depths of suffering and wisdom and experience deep down. And it reminded me of the description in The Lord of the Rings, where the hobbits look and see Treebeard's eyes, this Ent who's lived for thousands of years, for millennia, and seeing on the one hand the humor on the surface of the eyes, but this deep well of wisdom and experience and history beneath. That was so, I got this connection between Solzhenitsyn and Treebeard. There's an interesting thought for you.